Hello there, neighbors. Just a quick mention before we jump into the episode. I've been posting a lot more short-form content on TikTok and Instagram. So if you would be so kind, stop on over to either of those platforms and check it out. It's in the same vein as the things that I talk about on the podcast. Once in a while, there's some content there that's a little bit more lighthearted and comedic than the podcast itself, but I think you'll enjoy it. And if you do, please like, follow, and comment if you would. Alrighty then, let's move on to the episode. There are certain words in American politics that are not used to actually explain anything. They're used merely to set off alarms, to invoke a emotional response. And one of those words, especially on the right, is Sharia, as in Sharia law. You hear it said like, somebody found a trapdoor under the Constitution, like there is a secret Muslim courthouse being built behind the halal grocery store. Like the Bill of Rights is tied to a chair somewhere, blinking under a single light bulb, and an imam twirls a mustache and plans the overthrow of the government. And that's the trick, because most of the time when right-wing politicians and pundits say Sharia law, they're not defining it in any way. They're not explaining anything about Islam. They're not explaining religious liberty. They're not explaining how American courts actually work. They are just using the phrase as a panic button. Push it, and suddenly we're not talking about Muslim neighbors or Muslim parents or Muslim doctors or teachers or veterans or Muslim business owners, Muslim Americans who are just trying to live their lives. Now we're talking about a threat, a suspicion, invasion. The Constitution under siege from people whose religion the fear machine has already marked as foreign, dangerous, and incompatible with America. And before we go any further, there is one question that should be asked every single time someone tells you Sharia law is about to replace American law. How? That's the question. How? What is the mechanism? Is Congress going to hand the Capitol keys to a religious scholar? Are state courts going to throw out their law books because somebody opened a mosque? Is the Supreme Court going to announce that the Constitution has been superseded by a religious tradition most of the people yelling about it can't even accurately define? That's not how any of this works. In the United States, no religious law gets to override the Constitution. Not Islamic law, not Christian law, not Jewish law, not any religious doctrine from any tradition. People are free to believe, they're free to worship, they're free to follow religious teachings in their own lives, but those teachings do not automatically become civil law for everyone else. That's not hostility to religion. That's the arrangement that makes religious freedom possible in the first place. And that is why Sharia Panic deserves a closer look, because this is not really a serious legal debate. It's a manufactured crisis built on confusion and fear and religious bigotry, willful ignorance, and a strangely selective love of the Constitution. Sharia cannot supersede U.S. law, but the people screaming loudest about Islamic religious law are often the same people weakening the church-state barrier that protects all Americans from religious rule. So before we let another politician wave the words Sharia law around like a haunted flashlight, let's slow down. Let's define the thing. Let's separate religious practice from religious rule. And let's talk about why some people are so eager to convince Americans that their Muslim neighbors are a constitutional emergency waiting to happen. Happy Monday, everyone, and welcome to Your Neighbor on the Left podcast, where we talk about progressive politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name is Don Spielis, and I am your host. And today we're going to be talking about Sharia law. And what I'd like to say up front is that I plan to talk about this from a practical, non-fear-mongering perspective, because as you'll see as we go through some of this stuff, so much of what you hear, if not all of what you hear, is quite the opposite to that. It's meant to get you riled up and make you scared, and it's a tool, and it's a very good tool, but I want to dull it a little bit. So let's start off by doing the thing that the fear machine usually skips. Let's define the word. Sharia is often translated into English as Islamic law, and that translation is not exactly wrong, but it is incomplete. And because it's incomplete, it becomes very easy to scare people with it. Because when Americans hear the word law, we tend to think of the legal system, police and judges and courts and statutes, criminal penalties, government enforcement, a judge in a robe, somebody with the badge, somebody with the power of the state behind them. So when a politician says Sharia law, a lot of people immediately picture an Islamic version of American criminal law. They picture courts and punishments. They picture the harshest images they have ever seen attached to the word. And that is not an accident. That is the picture the Panic campaign wants in your head. But Sharia is broader than that. For many Muslims, Sharia refers to a religious and moral framework for living in accordance with Islam. It can include worship and prayer and fasting, charity, dietary rules, rules on marriage, family responsibilities, inheritance, ethics, particularly in business, financial practices, personal conduct, community obligations, how you're supposed to treat your neighbors and how you're supposed to treat the poor. In other words, for many Muslims, Sharia is not some sinister legal code hiding in a briefcase. It's a way of understanding how to live faithfully as a Muslim. Now, does that mean Sharia has never been used by governments as law? No, of course not. Some governments do use versions of Islamic law in their legal systems, and some of those governments absolutely deserve criticism, especially when their religious law is used to justify things like authoritarianism or gender discrimination or violence or coercion or, human rights abuses. We don't need to pretend that isn't true, but that is a very different claim from saying that American Muslims, by practicing their faith, are trying to replace the Constitution. That is the switch that's being made. That is where the fear campaign changes the subject and hopes that you don't notice. Because Sharia as personal religious guidance is not the same thing as Sharia being imposed as state law. A Muslim choosing to pray is not replacing American law. A Muslim fasting during Ramadan is not replacing American law. A Muslim choosing not to eat pork is not replacing American law. Neither is a Muslim giving to charity as part of their faith, or a Muslim family seeking religious guidance about marriage or parenting or money or grief or ethics. None of those things are a replacement for American law. All those things I just described are religious freedom. That is exactly the kind of thing this country claims to value and protect. And we understand this perfectly well when the religion feels familiar, or at least familiar to the majority. A Catholic can follow church teaching in their personal life. That does not mean canon law has replaced the Constitution. An Orthodox Jew can follow halakha. That doesn't mean that American civil courts are being overthrown. A Christian can make life decisions based on Scripture. That does not mean the Book of Acts is now, the Pennsylvania Crimes Code. A family can ask a pastor for guidance. Nobody hears that and says, well, there goes the Republic. Pastor Dave has seized the zoning board. But when Muslims follow religious guidance, suddenly certain people start yelling about creeping Sharia, like the First Amendment left the door open. And that's not analysis. That's suspicion wearing a lapel pin. And another important point, Sharia is not one single law book that every Muslim in the world follows in exactly the same way. There is no universal Sharia binder sitting in a conference room somewhere with, color-coded tabs and a little section marked America Phase 2. Islam, like other major religious traditions, contains interpretation and debate and disagreement, scholarship and culture and history. There are different schools of Islamic jurisprudence. There are different traditions. There are different communities. There are different countries. There are different individual believers. And that shouldn't surprise anyone. Christians certainly do not interpret Christianity the same way. You put a Catholic bishop, Southern Baptist preacher, a Quaker, a Greek Orthodox priest, a Pentecostal pastor, and a liberal Episcopalian in one room and ask them what Christianity requires in public life, well, put on a helmet and get ready, because the answers are going to vary wildly. Religions are not flat things. They move through centuries and languages and cultures and governments and families and actual human beings. They don't stay frozen in one simple form, so a politician can turn them into a campaign prop. And that is why the right-wing use of Sharia law is so misleading. They say it as though it means one thing, one code, one plan, one enemy. But that's not reality. That's just branding. If you can turn an entire religious tradition into one frightening phrase, you do not have to understand your neighbor. You don't have to distinguish between personal faith, religious scholarship, civil law, foreign governments, authoritarian regimes, private religious practice, and actual constitutional issues. You just say the word, Sharia, and you let the fear do the walking. So before we even get to courts and laws and arbitration or constitutional limits, that first lie has to be pulled apart. Sharia, as lived by many Muslims, is not a secret replacement government. It is a religious and moral framework. It is interpreted in many ways. It is practiced differently by different people. And in the United States, following religious guidance in your own life is in no way a threat to law. It is one of the freedoms the law is supposed to protect. Now, we've separated the word from the scare campaign. Let's now talk about what Sharia law is not in the United States. It is not a replacement constitution. It is not a parallel government. It is not a secret court system with authority over unwilling Americans. It cannot override federal law. It can't override state law. It can't erase civil rights protections. It cannot cancel criminal law. It cannot force non-Muslims to follow Islamic religious rules. It cannot turn an imam into a judge over your divorce or your property or your business or your kid's school or your town council or a criminal case or your constitutional rights in any way. That is simply not how American law works. And this is where the panic starts looking especially thin, because the Constitution already answers the question. The First Amendment protects religious belief and religious practice, but it also prevents the government from establishing religion. That means the government doesn't get to make one religion the law of the land. Not Islam, not Judaism, not Christianity. Not anything else, for that matter. That's the basic deal. Religious practice is protected, religious rule is not. And that is a distinction that matters. A Muslim can choose to live according to Islamic teachings. A Christian can choose to live according to Christian teachings, and so on and so on. For Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, Sikhs, atheists, agnostics, or anyone else can make a moral code and make choices based on that moral code and in their conscience and community and traditions. That is private liberty. That is not the same thing as public law. If a Muslim couple goes to an imam for marriage or for marriage guidance, that doesn't replace family court. If a Catholic seeks guidance from a priest, that doesn't replace civil law. Religious communities have always had internal rules, moral teachings, counseling traditions, and ways of resolving disputes. That is not unique to Islam. What matters legally is whether any of it is being forced on people or used to violate civil law. And American courts do not have to enforce religious decisions that violate public policy or criminal law or civil rights or basic legal protections. That part is important because sometimes the fear campaign will point to religious arbitration and act like it proves there's a takeover. But private arbitration exists in lots of contexts. Businesses use it, religious communities may use it, families may use it, contracting parties may use it, and when religious arbitration happens, whether Christian, Jewish, Muslim, or otherwise, it sits under the civil legal system. It does not float above it somewhere wearing some sort of tiny crown. The state is not required to enforce a religious ruling that breaks the law. If someone is coerced, if someone's rights are violated, if an agreement conflicts with public policy, the civil courts still matter. That is the difference between voluntary religious guidance and government-enforced religious power. The panic depends on blurring those two things together. It wants people to hear that a Muslim follows Sharia and imagine that their own rights are in danger somehow. But that leap makes absolutely no sense unless you already believe Muslim religious practice is suspicious by default. That is why the question how matters so much. How would Sharia supersede the Constitution? How would it override federal law or erase civil rights or replace criminal law? How would it bind people in any way who never agreed to it? The people spreading the panic usually don't get anywhere near those questions. They just keep repeating the word until fear fills in all the blanks. And you know, that's a lot of things, but it's not constitutional analysis. That's a political fog machine. The truth is much simpler. In America, a Muslim following religious guidance in private life is exercising his or her religious liberty. A Muslim community worshiping together is exercising religious liberty. A Muslim public official serving in government is exercising the same civil right as anyone else. None of that means Sharia has replaced American law. It means Muslims are Americans too, with the same rights as everyone else claims for themselves. And if that makes certain people uncomfortable, the problem is not the Constitution. The problem is that those people were sold a version of religious freedom that has lots of fine print. Freedom for me, suspicion for thee. So if Sharia cannot override the Constitution, can't replace American law, can't erase civil rights, can't force non-Muslims to do anything, then why does the panic keep coming back? Well, the answer it always is because it's useful. Not because the threat is real in the way it's being sold, not because there's some wave of American courts tossing out the Constitution and saying, you know what, let's try theocracy with subtitles. It keeps coming back because fear is politically useful. The Sharia panic turns Muslim religious life into some sort of evidence of danger. That's the whole game right there. It takes ordinary things and feeds them through this like suspicion grinder. A Muslim community wants to build a mosque and suddenly it's not a zoning issue, it's an invasion. A Muslim public official takes an oath of office and suddenly it's not democracy, it's a loyalty test. A Muslim family practices its faith and suddenly it's not religious liberty, it's creeping Sharia. And notice how different the language gets depending on who's doing the praying. A Christian praying before dinner is faith. A Muslim praying 5 times a day becomes a warning sign. A church expanding its building is community growth, but a mosque expanding its building becomes a national panic with cable news commentary. A Christian politician talking about God's plan for America is just conviction. A Muslim politician talking about religious freedom is suspicious. That double standard does not appear by accident. It has been created and cultivated. For years, politicians and activists have introduced anti-Sharia bills and pushed anti-Sharia rhetoric as if American law is standing at the edge of a cliff, one falafel truck away from collapse. These bills often claim to protect the Constitution, but the Constitution doesn't need protection as it's written and as the system works. What they're actually doing is singling out Muslims as uniquely dangerous. And the legal system has already noticed that problem. In Oklahoma, voters approved an anti-Sharia constitutional amendment in 2010. The measure was called the Save Our State Amendment because apparently no moral panic is complete without a title that sounds like it was printed on a bumper sticker. But federal courts blocked it. The 10th Circuit said that the measure likely violated the Establishment Clause because it singled out Islam for unfavorable treatment. And later, a federal court struck it down. Think about that. The people claiming to defend the Constitution from Sharia created a constitutional problem because they targeted Islam. That's anything but saving the state. That's setting the Constitution on the kitchen counter and then blaming Muslims because, it got something spilled on it. And this is the pattern. The panic claims to protect American law from a threat that is supposedly everywhere, but when pressed for actual examples of Sharia taking over American courts, the evidence evaporates. Because the goal is not to document a real takeover. The goal is to make Muslims look like a takeover waiting to happen. That is where the religious bigotry comes into the story. Not as a side issue, as a central ingredient. The Sharia scare depends on the idea that Muslims are less American by default. Somehow less loyal, less trustworthy, less compatible with democracy. It treats Islamic religious practice as inherently political, inherently foreign, and inherently dangerous. And once people accept that framing, almost anything can be made to look like it's a threat. A prayer room, a halal menu, a hijab, a mosque fundraiser, a Muslim candidate, a school accommodating religious holidays. Suddenly, ordinary religious freedom starts getting described like a border breach. That is why this panic is so corrosive. It does not just misinform people about Sharia. It teaches them to look at Muslim Americans and see a legal threat instead of a neighbor. And let's be honest about the emotional logic here. Most people who get worked up about Sharia law are not sitting at home reading comparative legal theory. They're not paging through court decisions and saying to themselves, I'm concerned about conflicts between private arbitration and public policy. Of course they're not. They're reacting to a story they have been told. A story that Islam is not really a religion like other religions. The story says Muslims are not really citizens like other citizens. The story says their faith is not a private belief. It's a political weapon. It says, if you do not stop them now, America will be lost. And that story is nonsense, but it's powerful nonsense. And it works because it gives people a target. It gives politicians a villain. It gives pundits an easy segment and fundraisers a subject line. And it gives voters something to fear instead of something to understand. That is the manufactured crisis. It's not a legal crisis. It's not a constitutional crisis. A political and cultural weapon aimed at a religious minority. Hard stop. And once you see that, then the next question becomes unavoidable. If these politicians are so freaking worried about religious law shaping government, are they equally worried when the religion is their own? Because that is where Sharia scares start to boomerang. If you think about it, this is where the whole argument turns around and smacks the fear campaign right in the back of the head. Because the people who most loudly warn about Sharia law usually claim they are defending the Constitution. They say they're protecting America and American law from religious rule. They say, they do not want religious doctrine imposed through government power. Wonderful, fantastic. Frame that sentence, put it on a mug. I agree 100%. No religious doctrine should become binding civil law over anyone or everyone. But then comes the problem. Because a lot of the same people screaming about Islamic religious law are totally comfortable when their version of Christianity is pushed in the government. Suddenly, that wall between church and state becomes negotiable. Suddenly, government neutrality is hostility to faith, and secular public education becomes anti-Christian, and putting religious doctrine into law isn't theocracy anymore. It's heritage, it's values, it's tradition, it's parental rights, it's restoring America. That is not a principle. That is a preferred seating chart. Because if you are against a religious law shaping government, then be against religious law shaping government. Not just when the religion is Islam, not just when the prayer sounds unfamiliar, or when the building has a crescent instead of a steeple. If the problem is religious doctrine becoming civil power, then the problem is religious doctrine becoming civil power. Period. And that means the same constitutional barrier that prevents Sharia from becoming American law also prevents Christian doctrine from becoming American law. That barrier is not an anti-religion weapon. It is not some atheist goblin hiding under James Madison's old desk. It is a protection. Church-state separation does not only protect non-religious people from religion, it protects every religion from every other religion. It protects Christians from Muslims. It protects Muslims from Christians, Jews from Christians, Christians from Jews, Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, atheists, agnostics, everybody. It keeps the government from picking a religious winner and then turning everyone else into guests in their own country. That is the part Christian nationalists either don't understand or just simply choose to ignore. Because when they weaken that wall for their own purposes, they're not just creating a special lane for Christianity, they're weakening the entire principle itself. You cannot say government should be allowed to enforce religious values, but only mine. That's a lot of things, but it is not constitutional law. And once you decide government can enforce religious doctrine, you have given up the strongest argument against anyone else doing the same thing if and when they have power. So here's the cleanest way to put it. If you believe government can enforce religious values, then you are not actually opposed to Sharia law on constitutional grounds. You are opposed to the wrong religion getting a turn. That's the boomerang. The Sharia Panic says, we must protect America from religious law. Fine. Then protect it from all religious law. Protect it from a state mandating Bible lessons in a public school. Protect it from government officials declaring that America belongs to one faith. Protect it from laws that turn one group's theology about abortion into criminal policy for everyone. Protect it from LGBTQ rights being carved up because one religious faction says its doctrine should outrank somebody else's civil rights. Protect it from public money being routed into religious education while pretending the First Amendment is just being dramatic. Protect it from the Ten Commandment displays being treated like neutral civics lessons, as if Moses stopped by the State House to update the curriculum. If the principle matters, it has to matter even when your side does not benefit, or it's not a principle. It's just a costume. And this is where the language gets especially slippery. When conservative Christians want their beliefs reflected in law, they call it values. When Muslims practice their faith publicly, it's called creeping Sharia. When conservative Christians organize politically around religion, they call it religious liberty. If Muslims organize politically around even just civil rights, they call it infiltration. When conservative Christians say public schools should reflect their beliefs, they say that falls under parental rights. When a Muslim parent asks for basic accommodation or equal respect, suddenly everybody is checking under the desks for the collapse of Western civilization. That double standard is not subtle. It's singing and dancing and wearing tap shoes, and it weakens the very protection that these people claim they care about. Because the best answer to Sharia panic is not anti-Muslim panic. It's constitutional consistency. No religion gets to run the government. That is the rule. Not no Islam, not no unfamiliar religion, not no minority religion. No religion. Religious people can vote. Religious people can serve in office. Religious people can bring their values into public debate. Nobody is saying otherwise. A Christian can argue from conscience. A Muslim can argue from conscience. A Jew can argue from conscience. But the law itself has to serve a public purpose beyond my religion says so. That is the line. And Christian nationalism spends a whole lot of time trying to blur that line, with a thumb and a wet napkin. The irony is thick enough to spread on toast. The same movement warning that Muslims want to impose religious law is the one working to make its own religious beliefs the assumed foundation of American government. They're not afraid of a religious law. They're afraid of religious competition. And that matters. Once the government starts favoring one faith, every other faith becomes vulnerable. The Muslim neighbor they're targeting today is the warning flare, but the principle they are damaging, it belongs to everyone. When you tear down the wall between church and state, you don't just open the door for your church. You open the door. And then you're going to have to live with whoever walks through it next. So what would a consistent principle actually look like? I don't think it's complicated. No religion gets to rule the United States. Every religion gets to exist in the United States. That's the whole argument right there. Simple enough to fit on a bumper sticker, which means there is absolutely no excuse for Congress to keep tripping over it like a rake in the garage. Religious people can participate in democracy. Of course they can. Religious people can vote. They can run for office. They can speak publicly. They can argue for policies. They can bring their moral convictions into public life. That is not the problem. The problem begins when one group decides its religious doctrine should become binding civil law over everyone else. That's the line. A Muslim can believe Sharia guides their life. A Christian can believe the Bible guides their life. A Jew can believe halakha guides their life. A Catholic can follow the teachings of the Catholic Church. A Buddhist can follow Buddhist ethics. An atheist can follow whatever secular moral reasoning they ascribe to. An agnostic can say, I'm still looking. Please stop yelling during school board meetings. All of that fits inside a free society very easily. What doesn't fit is the government choosing one religious framework and using state power to make everyone else live under it. That is why church and state separation matters so much, not because religion is bad, not because faith has no place in people's lives. It's not because religious people should be silent or invisible or locked out. It matters because the government staying neutral is the only way religious pluralism survives. Pluralism, it's a fancy word, but the idea is simple. Lots of different people, lots of different beliefs, living under one civil system where no group gets to make itself legally superior. That is not anti-Christian, nor is it anti-Muslim or anti-religion in general. That is how you keep this country from becoming a theological cage match with zoning permits. And this is where the Sharia Panic just reveals itself, because Muslim Americans aren't asking for special treatment when they ask to practice their faith. They're asking for the same religious liberty conservatives claim they love. Freedom to worship, freedom to pray, freedom to gather, freedom to build communities, freedom to live according to conscience as long as they are not violating civil law or the rights of others. That shouldn't be controversial. Not in a country that spends this much time putting eagles on things. But somehow when Muslims ask for the same basic freedom, these people who complain about Sharia suddenly discover a deep concern for secular government. And again, if they meant it, that would be fine. Welcome aboard. But if you believe no religious doctrine should control American law, then you and I agree. If you believe government should not impose faith on people, then we're on the same page. If you believe religious freedom, means the state doesn't get to choose winners and losers among religions, then you and I agree. But if your commitment to secular law only shows up when Muslims are involved, that's not a constitutional principle. That's religious bigotry. At best, religious favoritism, just, draped in red, white, and blue. Religious freedom cannot mean my religion gets public power and your religion gets public suspicion. It can't mean my prayer is heritage and yours is a threat. It can't mean my theology is values and yours is a threat. A consistent principle has to apply even when it protects people that you don't understand or don't like, especially then. Because that's the test. Rights are easy when they protect people who look like you and pray like you and vote like you. The real test is whether you defend the same rights for the person that these folks are telling you that you should fear. That is why the answer to Sharia panic is not more panic. The answer is clarity. No religious law supersedes U.S. law. No religious community loses its rights because politicians need a villain. No constitution worth defending has a little asterisk that says religious liberty available only for familiar religions. So when you hear somebody warning about Sharia law taking over America, listen closely. Not just to what they're saying, listen to what they're asking you to believe. They're asking you to believe that Muslim Americans are not simply practicing a religion. They're asking you to see them as some hidden legal threat. They're asking you to look at a mosque or a prayer room or a halal restaurant, a Muslim candidate, a Muslim neighbor, whatever, and hear ominous background music. They want you to forget how American law actually works and replace it with a ghost story. But the constitutional answer is crystal clear. No religious law supersedes U.S. law. Not Islamic law, Christian law, Jewish law, not any doctrine from any tradition. People are free to believe and worship and pray and gather, free to bring their values into public debate, free to live according to conscience within the limits of civil law and the rights of others. But nobody's religion gets to become government's command. That is the rule. And it's not a rule against faith. It's a rule that protects faith. It protects the Christian who does not want the state defining Christianity for them. It protects the Muslim who does not want their faith treated like a criminal warning label. It protects everyone. Jews, Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, atheists, agnostics, whatever. And the person who would very much like the government to stop acting like it has been deputized by somebody's Sunday school curriculum. That wall between church and state is not a weapon against religion. It's a shield for all of us. And the people trying to tear it down while screaming about Sharia are not saving the Constitution. They are not saving the Constitution. They are sawing through one of its load-bearing beams and yelling at Muslims for owning a hammer. That's the danger here. Not that Sharia is about to replace the Constitution. The danger is that fear and bigotry and selective constitutional concern are being used to convince us, or try to convince us, that some people's religious freedom counts less than others. And if we accept that, the damage doesn't stop with Muslims. It spreads, because a country that makes rights constitutional on familiarity is not protecting freedom. It's rationing it. And freedom rationed by fear is not freedom. It's permission. And nobody's basic rights should depend on whether their religion makes the majority comfortable. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to download and listen to this episode. I would love to hear your thoughts on this and on anything that you might want to share them about. Go to neighborontheleft.com and go to the contacts page. Either DM the podcast through social media or use the email address, whichever you prefer. While you're there, you can check out the episodes page and stream or download any episode of the podcast. And if you want to know where I'm getting my information, the blog section is for you, because the posts mirror the podcast topics, and I put all of my sources with links for you to check out. I'll be back on Wednesday with another episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. So between now and then, stay engaged, stay kind, and have the kind of week you'd wish for others.